This is my true story. I thought my family would value the life I gave to them. I thought my grandson would see me as a foundation, not a burden. But one day, he laughed at me. He called me worthless. He pointed at my wrinkled hands and mocked the years that shaped them. He didn't know those same hands held a secret that would shatter his arrogance. Before I tell you what he found, tell me where you're watching from and the time right now, and please subscribe for more stories. When my husband passed away, I was still young enough to rebuild my life, but too old to be seen as someone starting fresh. I had children who looked at me with tired eyes, expecting me to hold the family together without ever asking how heavy that weight really was. I stepped into the role without complaint, because that is what women of my generation did. We carried the burden silently, believing that love was measured by how much we gave, not by how much we received. My hands became the tools of survival. They cooked every meal, even when there was barely enough food to stretch across the table. They scrubbed floors until the skin cracked, bleeding quietly into buckets of water. They sewed torn clothes so my children could walk outside with dignity, their heads held high, never knowing the hours I spent hunched under a dim lamp, fixing seams that always seemed to split again. These hands, now lined with wrinkles and marked by age spots, were once strong and steady. They braided my daughter's hair before school, wiped the tears of scraped knees, and pulled weeds from the garden so there would be fresh vegetables on the plate. Every small act was part of a larger sacrifice. I didn't just raise children. I raised the foundation for their futures. I managed bills after my husband's death, cutting corners where I could, sacrificing my own comfort so they could have shoes that fit and books for school. I never allowed myself new clothes. My dresses grew thin, patched over and over, while my children walked in new shoes, bought with coins I saved from every corner of the house. I believed that one day, when I was old and fragile, they would look back and understand the depth of my devotion. I imagined my grandchildren sitting at my knee, listening to stories not because they had to, but because they wanted to understand the woman who gave everything for them. That dream kept me alive when the nights were long and the loneliness of widowhood felt unbearable. When my first grandchild was born, I cried not just from joy, but from relief. I thought my sacrifices had been worth it. Holding that little body, I felt the continuation of everything I had endured. I promised myself that this new life would grow strong because of me, because of the choices I made when I refused to crumble under grief. I cared for my grandson with the same patience I had shown my children. I walked him to school when his parents were too busy. I fed him when he was picky, singing quiet songs to encourage each bite. I stayed up late sewing costumes for school plays and patching up sports uniforms that ripped after games. I believed that if I gave him enough love, he would grow into a man who respected not only me, but the generations of women before me who sacrificed silently so men could stand proudly in the world. Every wrinkle on my hand is proof of that love. Every scar is proof of the battles I fought alone, battles no one saw, battles that left me tired but never defeated. But sacrifice is not always rewarded with gratitude. The truth I learned slowly is that people grow accustomed to your giving. They stop seeing the weight of your effort and instead see only what they lack. My children grew up with this sense of expectation. They took for granted that dinner was always ready, that bills were somehow paid, that the family held together no matter what storms came. They never stopped to ask how much it cost me, not in money, but in time, energy, and health. And when my grandson grew older, he inherited that same blindness. He didn't see the strength behind my tired movements. He only saw the slowness. He didn't see the history carved into my hands. He only saw the shaking fingers that dropped cups or struggled to button shirts. He didn't see the sacrifices behind his comfortable life. He only saw an old woman in the corner of the house, quiet and worn down. My hands, which had raised him, now embarrassed him. My clothes, which had been humble all my life, now looked outdated to his eyes. The meals I cooked with patience and care were dismissed as old-fashioned. I told myself it was just youth speaking, that one day he would grow into a man who understood. But deep inside, I feared the truth, that perhaps all my sacrifices had been wasted on a generation that believed comfort was their right, not a gift handed down by those who suffered before them. That fear hurt more than the aching joints in my fingers. It burned deeper than any insult, because it meant my life's work might fade into nothing but silence. Still, I carried on. Even when my grandson rolled his eyes at me, I made sure his clothes were folded neatly. Even when he laughed at my slow steps, I stayed awake to prepare his school lunch. Even when he looked away from me in public, ashamed of my presence, I prayed for him at night, asking God to give him wisdom. I did all this not because I was weak, but because I knew the strength it took to love unconditionally. My entire existence had been built on sacrifice, and though the world saw my hands as old and trembling, I knew their story was greater than any insult he could throw at me. For 40 years, I carried a secret. A part of me knew there would come a day when words would cut too deep, when sacrifice would no longer protect me from cruelty. That day would reveal what my hands had truly built, not just meals, not just clothing, not just love, but something far more powerful, something that would silence the arrogance forever. As my grandson grew older, the boy I once carried in my arms began to change before my eyes. At first, I told myself it was only youth, a phase all children must pass through as they wrestle with identity and pride. But slowly, the kindness I once saw in him dimmed, and arrogance began to take its place. It started small, so small that only a grandmother's heart could notice. He no longer smiled when I greeted him after school. He no longer sat beside me to listen to stories or ask for help with homework. Instead, he moved away from me, as if my presence were something heavy, a shadow that embarrassed him. His eyes, once wide and innocent, now carried impatience whenever I spoke. My voice, the same voice that once sang him to sleep, became background noise to him, something he wished would fall silent. In public, the change grew sharper. When we walked together, he began to quicken his steps, leaving me behind. At first, I thought it was his youthful energy, but soon I realized it was shame. He did not want his friends to see him walking beside an old woman with slow steps, bent posture, and clothes that no longer followed modern fashions. When his friends came to visit, I could hear the way his tone changed. Around them, he spoke louder, more confident, full of jokes and laughter. But whenever I entered the room, that joy vanished. He lowered his voice or rolled his eyes, as if I were an intruder, as if my very existence was something that interrupted his world. I tried to hide the sting, smiling politely, retreating to corners of the house where my presence would not disturb him. The signs of arrogance continued to grow. He began to mock my movements. If I struggled to bend and pick up something, I saw him smirk, sometimes even imitate me when he thought I would not notice. If my hands shook as I poured tea, his eyes would dart toward them with a look not of concern, but of ridicule. The same hands that had held him steady when he learned to walk, the same hands that cooked meals for him, were now objects of entertainment, fuel for his cruel jokes. He saw age as weakness, forgetting that age is proof of endurance, survival, and sacrifice. He forgot that those hands had once carried his father, his mother, and finally him, through storms that he had never experienced. My clothes became another target of his arrogance. I had always dressed simply, in garments that were clean and well kept, but not fashionable. To me, clothing was not for display, but for purpose. Yet to him, fashion was everything, and my dresses, my scarves, my sweaters patched with care became objects of mockery. He sneered at my choices, made faces when I entered a room, and told his friends stories about how old-fashioned I was. I never answered. I let the humiliation wash over me in silence, carrying it deep into the quiet of my nights. As he grew into his teenage years, his arrogance hardened into entitlement. He began to expect everything without effort, believing comfort was his natural right. He demanded new clothes, new devices, and new luxuries, never pausing to see who sacrificed behind the curtain of his life. He never asked how the bills were paid, how the food arrived on the table, or how the lights stayed on. He only asked for more, as if my sacrifices were invisible, as if my old age had erased the value of all the years that came before. His arrogance blinded him to the truth of the world, that nothing is free, that behind every gift is someone else's struggle, someone else's suffering. What cut me most deeply was the way he began to act ashamed of me. When his friends visited, he avoided introducing me, as if acknowledging my presence would stain his pride. He never invited me to events, never wanted to be seen beside me in public. On birthdays and celebrations, he accepted my gifts with a cold nod, never looking at me, never thanking me. The boy who once hugged me tightly now avoided even brushing my hand. To him, I was no longer a grandmother, no longer a foundation of the family. I was just an old figure in the background, fading into irrelevance. But in the quiet, when no one saw, I carried the weight of these humiliations. Each smirk, each roll of the eyes, each whispered insult in front of friends became a stone laid on my heart. I stayed silent because I had learned all my life to endure. Women of my generation were trained to swallow their pain, to believe that silence was strength. Yet deep inside, I felt the sorrow grow heavy. I had dreamed that my grandson would honor the years I had given, the sacrifices carved into my body, the wrinkles etched into my face. Instead, he treated those signs of love as proof of worthlessness. Still, I did not fight back. I remained quiet, convincing myself that time would teach him. I thought that one day, when life tested him, he would remember me and realize how wrong he had been. I thought that when he faced hardship, he would look back at the grandmother who had carried storms without complaint and see strength where once he saw weakness. But arrogance rarely corrects itself. It feeds on silence, growing bolder with every unchallenged insult. And though I bore the pain quietly, I knew there would come a day when the balance would shift. For arrogance always blinds itself to truth, and truth has a way of revealing itself when least expected. His dismissive words, his mocking gestures, and his cold avoidance were not just signs of disrespect. They were the early cracks in the foundation of his character. And though he believed himself powerful, clever, and modern, he was building a life on pride without gratitude, arrogance without humility, and selfishness without understanding. Such a life is fragile, waiting for the moment it collapses under the weight of its own blindness. And when that moment came, it would not be anger that exposed him. It would be the quiet truth I had hidden for 40 years, the truth that would turn his arrogance into shame and force him to see me not as worthless, but as the woman who held more power than he could ever imagine. One afternoon, the quiet disrespect that had been building for years finally broke into open cruelty. I was sitting in the living room, folding laundry with slow and tired hands. My fingers trembled slightly as they tried to smooth the wrinkles out of shirts and pair the socks together. These were the same hands that once worked with perfect speed, the same hands that once moved through chores without hesitation. But age had changed them. The joints were swollen, the skin thin, the veins raised and blue beneath the surface. They no longer obeyed me with the strength of youth, yet they still tried to serve the family in every way they could. It was in that moment, as I leaned forward to fold a heavy towel, that my grandson walked past me. He stopped, watched me for a moment, and then his voice, sharp and mocking, cut into the room. He told me I was worthless. He looked down at my hands and laughed at them. He pointed at the wrinkles, the shaking fingers, the spots of age, and said they could no longer do anything useful. His laughter rang out like a cruel bell, bouncing against the walls, echoing in my chest. It was not the laughter of a child, not the laughter of joy, but the laughter of superiority, a sound that carried the weight of judgment. For a moment, time stopped. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold, pressing into me harder than any burden I had carried before. I had endured silence, I had endured avoidance, I had endured mockery in small pieces. But this was different. This was direct, sharp, and undeniable. My grandson, the boy I once carried close to my chest, had not just dismissed me, but had declared me worthless. My heart sank deeper than the wrinkles on my palms. It felt as if every year of sacrifice, every night of loneliness, every day of labor had been erased in a single moment by a boy who had never known true struggle. His words cut deeper than knives, because they came not from strangers, not from enemies, but from the very life I had nurtured. I stared down at my hands after he left, the sound of his laughter still echoing in my ears. I turned them over slowly, palms facing up, then down again, studying the lines, the scars, the marks of time. To him, they were symbols of weakness. To me, they were a map of survival. These hands had held my husband's when he lay dying, promising him I would hold the family together. These hands had carried my children when they were too small to walk, rocking them through nights of fever and fear. These hands had cleaned houses for other families when money was short, scrubbing floors on my knees to make sure my children never went hungry. These hands had planted gardens, pulled weeds, and harvested food to fill our table when there was no money left for markets. These hands had written letters, paid bills, stitched torn clothes, and held this family together through storms no one else even noticed. Every wrinkle was a story, every vein was a sacrifice, every scar was proof of endurance, yet none of that mattered to him. To him, the only truth was what he could see in the moment. Trembling fingers, thin skin, and the slowness of age. He looked at me and saw a burden, not a foundation. He laughed because he believed he was above me, stronger, more capable, more worthy. In his eyes, I had been reduced to nothing. The humiliation cut deep, deeper than any insult I had ever endured in my life. For a grandmother to hear the word worthless from her grandson is not just pain, it is betrayal. It is the realization that the love you poured into someone has hardened into contempt. That night, as I lay in bed, the words would not leave me. They repeated themselves over and over, haunting me in the silence. Worthless. My own flesh and blood had given me that name. I stared at my hands in the dim light, remembering every moment they had given life, only to now be mocked as useless. Tears slid down my face, not loud sobs but quiet streams, the kind that soak into pillows and never find a voice. I wept not just for myself, but for the blindness of a generation that could not see beyond the surface of things. I wept for a boy who could not see the value of endurance, the worth of sacrifice, the beauty of resilience. I wanted to scream, to shout, to defend myself. I wanted to tell him that without these old hands, he would not even exist in the comfort he now took for granted. I wanted to throw his words back at him, to remind him of the nights I stayed awake so his father could sleep, the mornings I worked so he could eat. But instead, I stayed silent. My silence was not weakness, it was control. I knew in that moment that anger would not teach him, rage would not change him, and shouting would not awaken him. He would laugh again, dismiss my words, and walk away. No, silence was stronger. Silence allowed the wound to settle, but it also gave me space to remember the truth. He believed my hands were powerless. He believed my age erased my worth. But he did not know the secret they held. He did not know the papers they once signed, the business they once helped build, the wealth they once secured. As I lay in bed, his cruel laughter in my ears, I realized something important. His words, as painful as they were, had ignited something inside me. They reminded me why I had kept my secret. They reminded me why I never told anyone what those papers meant. Because one day, the arrogance of youth would need to be broken. One day, the truth would need to rise. And when that day came, the same hands he mocked would be the ones to reveal the power he could never imagine. That night, after the cruel laughter had faded and the house had grown quiet, I sat alone in my room staring at my hands. The lamp on the table cast a weak glow, and every wrinkle on my skin seemed deeper, every vein sharper, every tremor more visible. His words had carved themselves into me. I could still hear the echo of his mockery ringing inside me like a bell that refused to stop. I turned my palms upward and then downward, studying them the way one studies an old map. These hands, the same hands he had called worthless, held the story of an entire lifetime. I saw the burns from stoves, the scars from sewing needles, the faint marks from scrubbing floors, the rough patches from years of washing and ironing. To me, every line told a story of survival, but to him, they had become a punchline. The sorrow of that realization sat heavy inside my chest, pressing down with a weight that no one else could see. I remembered the years when those hands were strong and steady, able to carry heavy loads, able to hold children close without shaking, able to cook meals for dozens of people when the family gathered. I remembered the strength I once felt, the certainty that I could take care of everyone, no matter how hard life became. And then I looked at myself now, slow, fragile, trembling. I asked myself if he was right. Was I really worthless now? Had I given everything only to become a burden in the end? The thought pierced deeper than any insult. I wanted to reject it, to remind myself that worth is not measured by speed or strength, but by love, by sacrifice, by endurance. Yet in the silence of that night, with no one to speak for me, his words settled like poison. I wept quietly, tears sliding down my cheeks. I pressed my hands together, feeling the bones, the thin skin, the weakness. I thought about how they used to braid hair, how they once carried groceries, how they wiped away tears from small faces, how they sewed clothes late into the night to save money. Each wrinkle was proof of something I had done, each mark a memory of care. But those memories brought no comfort now, because the person I had given the most to could not see them. He only saw age, decay, and fragility. My love had been invisible, and my sacrifices unacknowledged. That was the pain that burned deepest, not the insult itself, but the blindness behind it. The next morning, I carried on as always. I cooked breakfast, folded clothes, cleaned the house. My grandson walked past me, and though his cruelty from the night before was fresh in my mind, he acted as though nothing had happened. That was the sharpest cut of all. To him, it was just a laugh, a passing moment, forgotten as soon as it was spoken. But to me, it was a wound that would never fully heal. That is the curse of cruel words. They vanish from the lips of the speaker, but they live forever in the heart of the listener. I smiled faintly at him, though inside I felt the hollow ache of sorrow. I would not let him see my pain. If he thought me weak, I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing tears. Days turned into weeks, and though I carried on as always, the silent pain never left me. At night, I stared at my hands and wondered how a lifetime of work could be erased so easily. I thought about my husband, gone long ago, and I asked myself what he would say if he saw me now. I wondered if he would tell me I had done enough, if he would remind me that worth is not something another person can give or take away. But the silence of the room gave me no answers. I was left only with the echo of laughter and the weight of my sorrow. I noticed how my body moved differently after that day. Folding laundry felt heavier. Cooking felt slower. My steps seemed weaker. The weight of being called worthless settled into my bones, making everything harder. Pain does not only live in the heart, it spreads into the body. I carried his words everywhere I went, a shadow that followed me into every task. When I scrubbed a pot, I remembered his laughter. When I stitched a torn shirt, I remembered his sneer. When I carried a basket of clothes, I remembered the sound of his voice calling me useless. Every action became tied to the memory, and the memory was a wound that refused to close. But in that silence, in that pain, I also found reflection. I remembered that my hands were not empty. They did not just carry wrinkles, they carried history, they carried strength, and they carried a secret. For decades, I had hidden something no one in the family knew. In that chest, locked away, were the papers that told a different story, not of weakness, but of foresight, endurance, and hidden power. His laughter had made me feel worthless, but it also reminded me why I had kept that secret. Because one day, when the cruelty became too much, I would reveal the truth. And when that day came, the boy who mocked my hands would learn just how much they had built. Still, until that day arrived, I carried the pain silently. Outwardly, I remained the same grandmother, doing chores, keeping the house in order, speaking softly. Inwardly, I was wounded, bleeding invisibly from words that no one else could see. That is the cruelest part of aging, not the weakness of the body, but the invisibility of pain. People see your slowness, your fragility, your wrinkles, but they do not see the storms inside your heart. They think age has made you numb, but in truth, age has made you feel even more deeply, because you have lived long enough to understand the weight of every word. My grandson thought his laughter would fade into nothing, but it became the deepest memory I carried. And though I stayed silent, I began to prepare inside myself. Silent pain is not weakness. It is waiting. Long before my grandson was born, long before my children even knew the meaning of money, I carried a secret that became my shield against despair. It began in the early years after my husband died. I was left with very little, just a small savings account, a house that seemed too large without him, and the heavy weight of responsibility pressing on my shoulders. Many women in my position would have collapsed under the strain, but I had lived my life knowing that survival meant adaptation. I could not simply grieve and let the world take from me what little I had left. I had to think ahead, for my children, and for the life that would come after me. One evening, when the house was quiet and the children asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a friend of my husband who had come to speak with me. He told me about a small business opportunity, a modest partnership in a company that had just started. At that time, it was nothing more than a workshop with a handful of workers and big dreams. It required courage to invest, because I had so little to give, and losing it would have meant disaster. But something inside me told me that survival did not come from holding on to what was safe. It came from planting seeds in the soil of risk. So I took a portion of what I had, signed the papers with hands that trembled but were determined, and became a silent partner in a business no one believed would succeed. The years passed, and while I kept working hard at home, while I scrubbed floors and sewed clothes to keep the family fed, that small business began to grow. It started to expand into new towns, then into new cities, and slowly it began to make profit after profit. I received letters, updates, and eventually payments that I tucked away quietly, never speaking of them to anyone. My children were young, reckless, and careless with money. I knew if they discovered what I had, they would waste it before it could bloom into something greater. So I locked away the papers, hid the contracts, and kept silent. I lived as though I had nothing, wearing patched clothes, eating plain meals, and working tirelessly. To the world, I was a poor widow carrying her family through sheer willpower. But in truth, I was a silent guardian, holding wealth in my hands that no one could see. Decades went by, and the company became bigger than anyone had imagined. Its name appeared in newspapers, its factories employed hundreds, and its products reached far across the country. My small share, which had once been almost worthless, grew into something unimaginable. I knew its value, but I also knew the dangers of revealing it. People change when they see money. Love turns to greed, respect turns to hunger, and families tear themselves apart over inheritance. I had seen it happen to others. That is why I never told my children, never told my friends, never even whispered it aloud when I was alone. The papers remained locked in a chest, buried beneath blankets and keepsakes, hidden where no careless eyes would stumble upon them. For 40 years, that chest became the keeper of my secret life. There were times when I was tempted to use it. When bills came heavy, when the house needed repairs, when I grew older and the work became harder, I looked at that chest and thought of what it could solve. But each time, I reminded myself that true sacrifice is not about ease, but about endurance. I chose to keep living as if I had nothing, because in that way I ensured the wealth would grow untouched, waiting for the right moment. It was not greed that made me hide it. It was protection. I wanted to leave behind something greater than temporary comfort. I wanted to leave behind proof that my life had not been wasted, that the woman who seemed silent and poor had, in fact, built a legacy too strong to be broken. And so, as my children grew, as my grandchildren were born, I carried that secret inside me. No one knew. They looked at me and saw a woman who struggled, who worked endlessly, who aged into wrinkles and slow steps. They pitied me sometimes, ignored me other times, but never once did they imagine that behind my quiet eyes was a secret wealth larger than their entire futures. I never spoke of it, not even when my children argued about money, not even when they treated me as if my opinions no longer mattered. I carried the weight of their disrespect, knowing that one day the truth would rise. My grandson, the one who laughed at my hands, believed I was powerless. He saw only the fragile skin, the weak movements, the shaking fingers. He thought time had taken everything from me. But he was wrong. My silence was not emptiness. My silence was strength. Every wrinkle he mocked was formed while I carried this secret, while I built a future in shadows that he could not comprehend. He thought my hands could no longer build, but he did not know they had already built something greater than he would ever achieve on his own. The chest remained locked in my room for decades, untouched except for the times I checked to make sure the papers were still safe. The contracts, the share certificates, the records of payments, all of it was still there, each document proof of what I had done. To others, it was just paper, but to me, it was the story of survival written in ink. It was the proof that my life had value far beyond what anyone saw. I knew that one day, when the cruelty of the world pushed too far, when the pain of disrespect cut too deep, that chest would be opened. And when that happened, the arrogant eyes of my grandson would see not weakness, but the truth. He would see that the hands he mocked were the same hands that had once signed the papers that changed the course of an entire company, the same hands that carried a hidden fortune while living humbly in silence. For 40 years, I had hidden my secret. For 40 years, I endured sacrifice without complaint. For 40 years, I let the world believe I was powerless, but the truth was waiting. And though I never planned revenge, though my silence was born of love, his laughter, his insults, and his cruelty would soon awaken the hidden power I had carried all along. The day my grandson mocked my hands and called me worthless was the moment something inside me shifted. Until then, I had endured his arrogance in silence. I had convinced myself that love meant patience, that respect would grow with time, that eventually he would see what I had given and understand. But that laughter, sharp and cruel, broke the last thread of forgiveness I had left. I realized then that some lessons cannot be taught by kindness. Some lessons require truth, and truth, when it finally arrives, can strike harder than any insult. That night, as I sat alone staring at the chest that had guarded my secret for 40 years, I felt the weight of my silence. For decades I had hidden those papers, not out of fear, but out of love. I had wanted to protect my family from greed, from fighting, from tearing themselves apart over wealth they had not earned. But now I saw that silence had also allowed arrogance to grow unchecked. My grandson's cruelty was not just a reflection of his youth, it was a symptom of blindness, a blindness that only the truth could cure. I walked slowly to the chest, my fingers trembling as they touched the lock. I had not opened it in years. Dust gathered on its corners, a quiet reminder of how long the secret had been buried. When I lifted the lid, the smell of old paper and wood filled the air. Inside were the documents I had kept hidden, the original contracts, the certificates of ownership, the letters of profit, and the records that proved my stake in the business. I touched them gently, remembering the courage it had taken to sign them when I had nothing but determination. Each paper was more than ink. It was proof of my foresight, my strength, and my endurance. Looking at them now, I felt no greed, only a quiet sense of justice. My grandson thought I was powerless, but these papers told another story. These papers said I had more strength than he could ever imagine. For the first time in 40 years, I began to plan what I would do with the truth. I did not want revenge in the cruel sense of the word. I did not want to hurt him. What I wanted was to teach him, to show him that arrogance built on ignorance is fragile, to remind him that every life he dismissed was built on sacrifice he could not see. If he believed my hands were worthless, then he needed to see what those hands had built in silence. I decided that the time for hiding was ending. The chest that had stayed locked for decades would soon be opened, not by me, but by him. For only in his own discovery would the truth have the power to break him open and force him to see. I began to prepare in small ways. I gathered the documents neatly, placing them in a way that would catch his eyes if he ever dared to look. I dusted the chest, leaving it in plain sight, as though it were no longer important. I stopped locking it as tightly, though I never told anyone. I let it sit quietly in my room, waiting. I knew his arrogance, his entitlement, his nosiness would eventually lead him to it. He had already shown his habit of taking what was not his, of prying into corners he had no right to. I knew it was only a matter of time before he stumbled upon the chest. And when he did, he would not find old keepsakes or faded photographs. He would find a truth so heavy, it would crush his arrogance into dust. In those weeks of waiting, I watched him more closely. Every insult he threw, every look of contempt, every roll of his eyes only strengthened my resolve. I no longer felt the same hollow sorrow as before. Instead, I felt a quiet fire, a sense of control returning to me. He thought he had stripped me of dignity, but I knew something he did not. I knew his laughter was temporary. I knew his arrogance was fragile. I knew the truth I held in silence would one day cut through his pride and leave him staring at himself in shame. And for the first time in many years, I felt no fear of the future. I felt strength in my silence because I was no longer just enduring. I was waiting. The turning point was not just about the chest or the papers. It was about me. For decades, I had allowed myself to be invisible, believing that humility was the same as silence, that love meant erasing myself so others could shine. But that moment, that laughter, taught me differently. Humility is not allowing others to trample over your worth. Love is not letting cruelty go unchallenged. I realized then that my silence had protected my secret, but it had also allowed disrespect to grow unchecked. And so, I chose differently. I chose to let the truth speak for me. I chose to let the weight of what I had built fall directly on the boy who mocked me. As the chest sat waiting, I no longer looked at my hands with sorrow. I looked at them with pride. Yes, they were old. Yes, they were wrinkled. Yes, they trembled. But they were also the hands that signed those papers, the hands that cooked meals, the hands that held children, the hands that survived storms. They carried history, sacrifice, and now, hidden power. His insult had been cruel, but it had also awakened me. It had reminded me that even in my old age, I still had the ability to shape the future. The turning point was not only about revealing the truth to him, it was about reclaiming my worth for myself. And so I waited, patiently, silently, with the strength of a woman who had endured too much to be broken by laughter. I knew the day would come when his arrogance would lead him to that chest, and when it did, the truth would rise. The turning point had arrived, and there was no going back. It happened sooner than I expected. My grandson's arrogance, which had always driven him to take more than he was given, became the very reason he uncovered the secret I had hidden for 40 years. One afternoon, after another bitter argument where he dismissed me with cold eyes, I left my room as usual. But this time, the chest sat unlocked, the lid resting gently, waiting for curious hands to open it. I had stopped hiding it, stopped pretending it was nothing more than a box of old blankets and trinkets. I left it in plain sight, knowing his entitlement would not allow him to ignore it. He entered my room when he thought no one was watching. His footsteps were hurried, impatient, like someone who believed the whole house belonged to him. He pulled the chest forward, his fingers eager to pry into what was not his. At first, I think he expected to find old keepsakes, perhaps photographs, letters, or small treasures from a long life. He must have thought he would laugh at what he found, mock the sentimentality of an old woman who held on to scraps of memory. But when he lifted the lid and pulled out the first stack of papers, his entire world shifted. Inside were not trinkets or family photos. Instead, he saw neat rows of contracts, certificates, and financial statements. He saw signatures written in my careful hand, binding me to a company that had grown far beyond its humble beginnings. He saw proof of ownership, shares that had multiplied in value year after year. He saw records of profits that reached amounts far greater than anything he had ever touched. Each page he flipped through struck him harder than the last. What he thought was weakness was, in truth, hidden strength. What he thought was poverty was quiet wealth. What he thought was silence was patience. I watched from the doorway, unnoticed at first, as his arrogance collapsed into shock. His face changed from curiosity to disbelief, from disbelief to fear, from fear to shame. He shuffled through the papers as if hoping they were lies, as if the ink would fade if he looked long enough. But the truth was undeniable. His worthless grandmother had been a silent partner in a company worth millions. The same old hands he had mocked had once signed the documents that built this fortune. The same hands he laughed at had carried a secret legacy greater than anything he could ever build himself. In that moment, I saw the boy stripped of all his pride. His back bent, his lips tightened, his eyes darted across the papers as though they were mirrors forcing him to see himself differently. The laughter he once threw at me was gone. The arrogance in his voice had vanished. What remained was the raw realization that he had been blind. He had mocked what he did not understand. He had called worthless what was, in truth, priceless. For me, it was not revenge that filled my heart. It was not anger or cruelty. It was justice. It was the moment I had waited for, the unveiling of the truth that silence had carried for so long. My grandson had discovered the hidden power I never flaunted, the wealth I never used for vanity, the proof that age does not erase worth. He thought he held the future in his youth, but now he understood that the foundation of his life had been built by the very woman he dismissed. The discovery was not loud. There were no screams, no accusations. It was quiet, almost sacred, the way truth often is. He held the papers, and I stood behind him, watching as his arrogance crumbled under the weight of reality. It was the day he learned that respect cannot be forced, but it can be earned, and sometimes it is revealed in silence at the exact moment it is needed most. The days after his discovery carried a silence heavier than any insult he had ever thrown at me. My grandson, who once walked through the house with loud footsteps and careless laughter, now moved quietly, almost as if he was afraid of the sound of his own presence. The arrogance that had once sat on his face was gone, replaced with something hollow. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, and the truth had stripped him bare. The papers he found were not just documents. They were a mirror, showing him how blind he had been, how cruel his words had sounded, how shallow his judgment had been. I noticed how he avoided my gaze at first. When I entered the room, he turned away. When I passed by, he lowered his head. The boy who once laughed at my hands now could not bring himself to look at them. He had mocked the wrinkles, the veins, the shaking fingers, but now he knew those same hands had built a legacy beyond his imagination. His silence was his shame, though he never spoke it aloud. I could feel it pressing between us in every moment. The rest of the family began to notice something different too. They saw how he had changed toward me, though they did not know why. They asked questions, but I kept my silence. I did not need to explain. The truth was no longer hidden in the chest. It was hidden in him, in the weight of what he now carried. For once, I did not feel invisible. I did not need to demand respect. It was already there, quiet and undeniable. Inside, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sorrow, because no amount of truth could erase the cruelty of the words he had spoken. There was pride, because the secret I had carried for 40 years had finally shown its purpose. And there was justice, because arrogance had been humbled not by anger, but by truth. I had not shouted, I had not begged, I had not argued. I had simply waited, and the weight of what I had built spoke louder than anything I could have said. One afternoon, I found him standing by the chest again. He was not mocking this time. He was not sneering or laughing. He stood there quietly, staring at the papers as if they held a language he had never understood. I walked past him slowly, and this time he did not turn away. His eyes met mine, and in that look, I saw everything. I saw guilt. I saw shame. I saw the beginning of respect, though it came too late to heal what was broken. From that day, his behavior changed. He no longer mocked me. He no longer laughed at my hands. He moved carefully around me, speaking less, but with a different tone when he did. But though respect returned, the wound inside me did not vanish. His words could not be taken back. His laughter could not be undone. He had already shown me how little he valued me, and no discovery could erase that pain. The truth had changed him, but it had also changed me. I no longer saw him as a boy who simply needed patience. I saw him as a man who had chosen cruelty, and only the shock of wealth had forced him to see me differently. The fallout of that discovery was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and heavy. He had been humbled, but the damage was already done. And as I watched him walk through the house, silent and changed, I realized that respect given out of guilt is not the same as respect born of love. His arrogance had been broken, but my trust in him would never return the same way again. After the discovery, the house no longer felt the same. The air was heavier, filled with an unspoken awareness that something had shifted forever. My grandson, once so loud and dismissive, walked as though each step carried a burden he could not drop. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, and now it followed him like a shadow. His laughter, which once echoed through the rooms with arrogance, was gone. In its place was silence, the kind that speaks louder than noise. He could no longer pretend I was weak. He could no longer look at my hands without remembering the papers they had signed, the fortune they had protected, the power they had carried in silence for decades. But the aftermath was not only about him, it was about me as well. For years, I had lived quietly, accepting the humiliation, swallowing the pain, letting my sacrifices go unnoticed. I thought silence was strength, but in truth, silence had hidden me away. When the truth came out, I did not feel only relief. I felt the weight of years pressing against me. It was justice, yes, but it was also sorrow, because I realized that it took wealth, it took papers and numbers for him to finally see me. My years of cooking, cleaning, sewing, raising, and sacrificing were invisible to him. Only money made him open his eyes. That was the deepest wound of all. The family soon learned pieces of what he had discovered. They asked questions, whispered to each other, speculated about what I had been hiding. I did not reveal everything, but I no longer denied it either. I let them know I had invested long ago, that my share had grown, that I was not as helpless as they believed. Their eyes widened, their tones changed, their respect returned. Suddenly, the woman they had seen as fragile and old was someone they looked at differently. But while their voices softened, my heart did not. Respect gained through discovery is not the same as respect given freely. It felt too late. My grandson tried to make small gestures. He carried bags when I went to the market. He offered to help with chores. He looked at my hands differently now, not with mockery, but with hesitation, as though every wrinkle reminded him of his cruelty. Yet I could not forget. I could not erase the sound of his laughter. I could not pretend his words had not pierced me. He wanted forgiveness, but forgiveness cannot be forced. It must grow naturally, and mine was buried too deep in sorrow to rise easily. In the quiet of my nights, I thought about what the aftermath truly meant. I had carried the secret for 40 years, believing it would protect me and my family. But now I understood its other purpose. It was not only protection, it was a weapon of truth, waiting for the day it would strike down arrogance. It had done its work. My grandson would never again call me worthless. He would never again laugh at my hands, but that did not mean the pain was gone. Respect had returned, but love had not. Trust had been broken, and no amount of money or discovery could stitch it back together. The house carried on, but nothing was the same. I moved through my days with the same routine, folding clothes, cooking meals, cleaning rooms. But now, each action was different. I no longer did these things to earn respect, for I had learned that sacrifice alone was not enough. I did them because they were part of me, because they were the way I showed love, even if love was not returned in the way I deserved. My grandson watched me with new eyes, but his silence could not erase the past. The aftermath was not healing. It was a reminder that words leave scars deeper than any wound. And so I accepted it. The truth had been revealed. The arrogance was gone. The respect had returned. But the relationship between us would never again be what it once was. I was no longer invisible, no longer mocked, no longer dismissed. But I was also no longer the same grandmother who believed patience would change him. The aftermath had taught me one final lesson. Silence carries power, but pain carries memory, and some memories never fade. In the end, justice did not come from anger or loud revenge. It came from the quiet choices I made after the truth had been revealed. My grandson's arrogance had been broken, but I knew respect born from guilt was not enough. I did not want him to bow his head only because he had seen the papers. I wanted him to understand that life is measured by more than wealth. Yet I also knew that people often show their true selves when faced with inheritance, and I had seen his true self already. The laughter, the cruelty, the word worthless could not be erased. They had shown me who he really was. And so, when I sat with my will and prepared the documents for my final years, I made my decision. For decades, I had saved and built in silence, not for vanity, but to ensure my sacrifices meant something long after I was gone. That wealth was my legacy, and I refused to let it fall into the hands of someone who had mocked me, belittled me, and treated me as if I were nothing. My grandson had revealed his character long before he discovered the chest, and no amount of shame could rewrite that truth. So, I rewrote my will. I directed my fortune away from him. Instead, I left it to the family members who had still shown me kindness, to the charities that helped widows like me, to organizations that fed hungry children and built schools in poor villages. I wanted my wealth to be used as a seed of good, not as a reward for arrogance. The decision brought me peace. For so long, I had carried the pain of being invisible, of giving without recognition, of enduring without thanks. Now I held the power to decide how my life's work would be remembered. I thought about my grandson and how he would react when the day came. He would expect everything because arrogance always expects more. But instead, he would find nothing. He would look for his name on those papers and see it missing. And in that silence, he would learn his final lesson, that wealth is not owed to those who show disrespect. Wealth is not a gift for cruelty. Wealth is a mirror of character, and his reflection had already failed him. I did not make this choice with hatred. Hatred is heavy, and I had carried enough weight in my life. I made this choice with clarity. I gave my love, my strength, and my sacrifices freely, but I would not give my legacy to someone who had looked at me and seen only weakness. He mocked my hands. He laughed at the lines that told the story of my survival. But those same hands signed the documents that built a fortune, and those same hands signed the will that would close the door on his arrogance forever. In the quiet of my final years, I no longer feared being called worthless. I had proven to myself that my worth was never measured by the eyes of others, but by the life I had lived and the strength I had carried. My grandson could never take that from me. The world may forget my sacrifices, but the papers I left behind would tell the story, not only of money, but of resilience, not only of wealth, but of justice. When I looked at my hands for the last time, I no longer saw weakness. I saw history. I saw sacrifice. I saw power. They were not the hands of a worthless woman. They were the hands that raised a family, carried pain, and built a future. They were the hands that held the secret which humbled arrogance and rewrote destiny. In the end, my justice was simple. He mocked my old hands, but those same hands ended his future.